Let's dive into some major global happenings today, starting with Gaza. Renewed conflict has flared up there.
Yeah, it's a tough situation. Tragically, after those ceasefire talks broke down, Israeli strikes have reportedly killed at least 220 Palestinians.
Wow, that's a big jump from the truce back in January.
Absolutely. And the Israeli military says they were targeting Hamas specifically.
Right, right.
They're saying a senior Hamas security official was among those killed in these, intense airstrikes all across Gaza. Some even happened during those pre-dawn Ramadan meals, which just adds another layer to this whole thing.
Oh, I see. And Israel's prime minister's office is placing the blame squarely on Hamas, saying it's because they just won't release the hostages and wouldn't budge on the mediator's proposals.
Exactly. And they're saying there's going to be even more military action against Hamas coming. Like, Israel's UN ambassador even went as far as to say there'd be no mercy until those hostages are released. It's a pretty stark warning.
So what exactly caused these ceasefire talks to fail again? I mean, it seems like every time they get close, something falls apart.
You hit the nail on the head there. The problem is that both sides have these core demands that are just completely at odds with each other, and it always leads to a stalemate.
Right.
Israel's main focus is getting all those hostages back, unconditionally. But Hamas, they're looking for a permanent end to that blockade on Gaza, plus they want a lot of Palestinian prisoners released.
And Israel's not going for that, huh?
Not at all. They see those demands as completely off the table, so you've got this huge gap in their goals, and that makes any kind of lasting peace seem, well, almost impossible right now.
Shifting gears a bit, let's talk about Ukraine. Seems like we might be entering a new chapter with this planned call between Presidents Trump and Putin. Trump's even saying they've got key parts of a peace agreement already hammered out.
Yeah, he's been saying there's been some progress, that they've agreed on many elements, but much remains. But Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, he's not so optimistic. He's actually accusing Putin of dragging this war out way longer than necessary. He's saying this whole agreement could have been put in place way earlier and saved a lot of lives.
That's a serious accusation.
It is. And to complicate things further, we're even seeing some mixed messages coming from within the Trump administration itself about where these agreements actually stand.
So what are we supposed to make of all these different takes from the U.S. side?
Well, Secretary of State Rubio has hinted that the focus has been more on getting everyone to the negotiating table than ironing out specific terms.
Okay.
And U.S. Envoy Witkoff, who just met with Putin, he's also being pretty cautious. Meanwhile, you've got key European allies like the U.K. and France basically urging Russia to show they're serious about peace. So, yeah, there's definitely some complexity here, maybe even different strategies playing out within the U.S. approach.
Now, turning to Canada, their newly elected Prime Minister, Mark Carney, has chosen Europe for his first big trip abroad, Paris and London specifically. And this comes right in the middle of those ongoing trade spats with the U.S. under President Trump.
This trip to Europe, it's definitely a calculated move. It shows just how much Canada values its relationships with those key European allies, especially with all the trade friction with the U.S. going on right now.
That's pretty interesting, isn't it? Like King Charles even met with Carney at Buckingham Palace, which seems like another gesture of support for Canada during these tense times with their neighbor.
Definitely.
That meeting with King Charles seemed really warm, even with that little funny bit about Carney's broken Order of Canada pin.
Yeah, I saw that.
And Carney also met with UK Prime Minister Starmer, just further strengthening those ties between their countries. And when reporters asked Carney about the whole lack of public support from allies regarding those U.S. trade policies, and even about Trump's past comments on maybe turning Canada into a U.S. state, Carney was firm. He stressed Canada's independence and national pride. What do you think? How important are these symbolic gestures from the monarchy when it comes to Canada's relationship with the U.S.?
Well, the king has to work within certain constitutional limits and follow the advice of his ministers, but there's no doubt these symbolic gestures carry a lot of weight, especially given what we know about how President Trump feels about the royals. Those little things like wearing Canadian decorations, marking Canadian anniversaries, even having Canadian artifacts around him, they subtly underscore that strong bond between the UK and Canada, especially at a time when things are rocky with the US.
All right, let's head back to the Middle East for a moment. President Trump has issued a pretty strong warning to Iran about those Houthi attacks in Yemen. He's threatened dire consequences if these attacks on international shipping keep happening.
Absolutely. He was very direct. He said that Iran would be held responsible for every shot fired by the Houthis.
And he's basically saying Tehran's behind all of it, right?
Exactly. And this warning came right after the Houthis claimed they kept targeting a U.S. aircraft carrier, which obviously didn't sit well. So in response, the U.S. military has launched some pretty major strikes inside Yemen.
But Iran's denying everything.
Yeah, they're saying they had nothing to do with it.
Trump's accusing Iran of giving the Houthis all this money, weapons, even intelligence, which Tehran flatly denies. And in the letter to the UN Security Council, Iran's envoy said they haven't broken the arms embargo on Yemen, and they're not trying to destabilize the region. So what's the U.S. military response been like recently?
Well, Pentagon officials say these recent U.S. strikes in Yemen have hit a wider range of Houthi targets than before, including drone experts. They say there's no proof of civilian casualties from these strikes, but that's obviously something that needs to be monitored closely.
Of course.
The U.S. is claiming they took out some important Houthi figures, but the group hasn't confirmed that. And, importantly, the Pentagon says their goal is to weaken the Houthis' ability to attack ships and to protect U.S. interests, not to try and overthrow the government in Yemen.
Okay, that's an important distinction. Now let's zoom over to Europe, specifically Germany. There's a big vote happening in their parliament, the Bundestag, about boosting defense spending. And this vote, a lot of people are saying it's super important for Europe's future security, especially with the war in Ukraine going on and all these questions about how committed that the U.S. will be to the continent in the long run.
You're absolutely right. Experts are saying this vote is absolutely crucial, especially after everything that's happened recently. It's really highlighted how much Europe needs to ramp up its own defense capabilities.
Yeah.
And Germany, they've got the biggest defense budget in the region, so they really set the tone for everyone else. They did increase their spending quite a bit last year, but this vote could unlock even more investment in their military.
But it sounds like getting this passed might not be a slam dunk.
Right. There's definitely some opposition. This new German parliament coming in, there's not total agreement on this whole increasing defense spending thing. The far-right AfD party, the Alternative for Germany, and the far-left Link party, they're both saying they'll vote against it.
So it's not going to be easy to get that two-thirds majority they need.
Exactly. And that's why this current parliament was seen as a better chance to get it approved. Of course, it still needs to get through Germany's upper house, but this was their shot.
So let's say this vote does go through. What could that mean for the bigger picture of European security?
Well, if Germany significantly increases its defense spending, it could be a real game changer. It could mean Europe is ready to take on a lot more responsibility for its own defense, relying less on others. It could also push other European countries to boost their own military investments, and that would have a ripple effect on the balance of power, and could even make NATO's European side stronger, especially if the U.S.'s commitment is seen as less certain going forward.
Now, for something completely different, astronauts Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams are finally on their way back from the International Space Station after their mission got stretched out way longer than planned because of some technical problems with their original spacecraft.
It's wild, right? These guys spent 9 months up there, way longer than their initial 8-day mission. They're coming back in a SpaceX capsule along with another NASA astronaut and a Russian cosmonaut. They're supposed to undock from the ISS Tuesday morning GMT and splash down off the coast of Florida later that day if the weather cooperates.
Fingers crossed for good weather. Their mission really grabbed people's attention because it went on for so long. I mean, coming back in that SpaceX Dragon capsule, they have to deal with a super fast re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, crazy high temperatures, and intense G-forces before those parachutes deploy for a water landing. What happened that caused this extended stay in the first place?
Well, Wilmore and Williams were actually supposed to be the first crewed test flight for Boeing's Starliner spacecraft.
Oh, right.
But that Starliner ran into some major technical snags on its way to the ISS, which made it too risky for them to come back in. An uncrewed Starliner did make it back safely later on, but NASA decided to use a SpaceX capsule instead, which had some extra seats for Wilmore and Williams when it took a new crew up to the ISS. So that's why their mission got extended so much. They kept doing experiments and spacewalks while they waited.
On a more serious note, there are reports of an alleged assault that happened at a remote Antarctic research station.
Yeah, this incident has everyone pretty worried, especially the small scientific team at that South African-run base. It's inland and really tough to get to. A South African government spokesperson confirmed there was an assault after earlier reports about some inappropriate behavior going on within the team.
And the South African Environment Ministry is saying they're taking these allegations super seriously. These research teams, usually around 10 people, including all sorts of specialists, they're often isolated for long stretches in incredibly harsh conditions.
Absolutely.
Some reports even say some team members were asking to be rescued. What makes these isolated environments so challenging for researchers?
Well, you're talking about extreme isolation, cramped living spaces, and very little in the way of external stimulation at these Antarctic research stations. It can really take a toll on people psychologically.
Yeah,
Even small disagreements can blow up in those conditions because everyone's constantly in close quarters and there are no normal social outlets.
I can only imagine.
While serious incidents are rare, the mental stress of these kinds of deployments is a well-known issue.
Absolutely. Turning now to North Macedonia, there have been angry protests after a deadly nightclub fire in Kokani. It's just awful. 59 people died, many of them teenagers.
It's a horrible tragedy. Reports say the fire at the Pulse nightclub started when sparks from flares hit the ceiling during a performance.
Wow.
Thousands have been protesting in Kokani demanding justice and accountability.
And understandably so.
They believe that poor safety measures, likely due to corruption, played a role in this disaster. Around 20 people have been detained for questioning so far, including the club owner and some former government officials.
Apparently, the nightclub was way over capacity and might have even been operating illegally in a converted warehouse with just one locked emergency exit. Some people were even saying there are hardly any fire extinguishers and no fire alarm or sprinkler system. It's just horrifying.
Yeah.
Interior Minister Saakashvili has said he suspects bribery and corruption were involved. Protests are still going on, some even targeting places connected to the club owner, and a civic group is calling for demonstrations all across the country. What does this tragedy tell us about some of the bigger problems in North Macedonia?
It really exposes some deep-rooted issues with safety regulations, oversight, and how corruption can actually put public safety at risk in North Macedonia. It's clearly sparked a lot of anger and demands for real systemic change.
Now, switching gears to Lithuania, prosecutors there are accusing Russia's military intelligence service, the GRU, of being behind an arson attack on an IKEA store in Vilnius last year.
Yeah, Lithuanian prosecutors have arrested 2 Ukrainian suspects in connection with the attack, which they're calling an act of terrorism. They're saying their investigation shows links, through middlemen, all the way to Russian military intelligence and security services.
And Poland's Prime Minister Tusk is backing them up, right?
That's right. He's saying he believes Russian secret services were responsible for fires at shopping centers in both Vilnius and Warsaw.
And yet Russia's still denying any involvement.
As always, they're maintaining that their secret services have nothing to do with any sabotage in Europe.
But this accusation comes after a string of other incidents, like those parcel fires targeting European courier companies last year, which were also blamed on Russia.
Absolutely.
And a lot of security experts see these things as part of a broader hybrid warfare strategy, the idea being to weaken European support for Ukraine. There was even another arson attack at a huge shopping mall in Warsaw right around the same time as the one in Vilnius.
Right.
And Lithuanian prosecutors say those 2 teenage suspects actually agreed in a secret meeting in Warsaw to set fire to shops in Lithuania and Latvia in exchange for money. What does this pattern of accusations tell us about what Russia might be doing in Europe?
It's definitely concerning, all these repeated accusations and the fact that these incidents seem coordinated. It all points to some very serious worries about Russia potentially running covert operations in Europe.
Right.
The goal, as many see it, is to destabilize things and chip away at that support for Ukraine.
And finally, the White House is pushing back against accusations that it ignored a judge's order regarding those recent deportations to El Salvador.
Right. This whole situation is pretty complex. The deportations involved a large group of people who were alleged to be Venezuelan gang members, plus some individuals supposedly from the MS-13 gang. Some of these deportations actually happened under the Alien Enemies Act, a law that's rarely used and goes all the way back to World War II.
And this all happened despite a temporary block from a U.S. district judge.
Exactly. But the White House is saying that the judge's order wasn't legitimate and that it was issued after the deportations were already done. What's more, neither the U.S. nor El Salvador has publicly named the individuals who were deported or given any real specifics about what crimes they supposedly committed or their alleged gang ties.
So it's all pretty murky. And then you have President Trump invoking the Alien Enemies Act, claiming there's been an invasion by this Venezuelan gang called Tren de Aragua. This act gives the president a lot of power to detain and deport citizens of an enemy nation if there's a declared war or invasion. But that's the thing. Are we really at war with Venezuela?
That's the question a lot of people are asking.
What are the legal and ethical concerns surrounding using this Alien Enemies Act in this situation?
Well, using the Alien Enemies Act here raises a whole bunch of legal and ethical red flags. Critics are saying the U.S. isn't at war with Venezuela, and a gang isn't the same as an invading army, so they're questioning whether it's even legal to use this act in this case.
I see.
There are also worries about due process, especially because these deportations happened so quickly and there wasn't much chance for legal challenges. And to make things even more complicated, the timing of the judge's order versus the deportations is still being disputed.
So there's a lot to untangle there.
Definitely. It raises serious questions about the limits of presidential power when it comes to immigration.
Well, that was a whirlwind of major global events we covered today. We talked about the renewed conflict in Gaza and the terrible loss of life, the potential turning point in the Ukraine war with President Trump planning to talk to Putin, Canada's strategic moves to strengthen ties with Europe, the U.S. president's firm warning to Iran about the Houthi attacks, Germany's crucial vote on upping its defense spending, those astronauts finally coming home from the ISS, that troubling incident at the Antarctic Research Base, the angry protests in North Macedonia after that deadly nightclub fire, Lithuania accusing Russia, and the White House defending itself on those deportations. Each of these stories is connected and is shaping the world as we know it. What are your thoughts on all this? What stood out to you the most?